Welcome to my final section of Chapter 4, in which we discuss 2050 and what it's going to look like for us as international marketers or business people in the next coming decades. Very fascinating section. The data, of course, has its limitations, so do not think this is concrete. Different scenarios can change the outcomes of what can happen in the coming decades. But since I was learning this data 10 years ago, not so much has changed, and these projections are still holding pretty strong. And I hope you guys get excited and continue to read into this. Much of it comes from PricewaterhouseCoopers, and I will be sharing that data with you in the file. Oops, here we go. So what is the world market going to look like in 2050? Well, what we do know is that emerging markets are going to dominate the share of the world's GDP, and that by 2050, the emerging 7 players will accompany up to almost 50% of global GDP, and that there's going to be rising nations that will grow faster than any others, such as Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh. But that also means growing consumerism in these markets and plenty of opportunities. So some of the key findings. First of all, China will become the largest economy in the world, where we've seen in the previous slide, it's like 30% of global GDP. So many other players are rising. So you'll see that there'll be 20% of a bigger pie, and that India and Indonesia will also jump. Emerging markets will take center stage here. When you look at somebody like Mexico being larger than the UK and Germany by 2050, and that the entire EU 27 nations as of today, if it doesn't change, will only account to less than 10% of the global GDP. Imagine what kind of consumer behavior will have shifted and what kind of political power will have shifted on an international level. And you need to be prepared for that. Old nations will not be the main player or the main deciding factor of what happens in the global markets. What kind of shifts are we looking at? Take a look at this. In GDP, and as we've learned before, purchasing power parity, some of these nations are dropping, like Japan, Germany, or you can see Italy and South Korea and Spain. Major drops, but some major jumps as well from Egypt, Nigeria, and the South Africa. A little dip and then a rise again. Or if you look at Mexico, just a constant stride up. So plenty of changes and plenty of opportunities. Unfortunately, what is going to happen, though, is there's going to be a greater disparity between GDP, PPPs, amongst economies by 2050. The United States will have a major discrepancy in its market share than what, say, China or India will have, and then a big difference between Indonesia and Brazil. And that's going to be a major impact on how our consumers domestically will have an internal market or buying power, so to speak. But keep an eye on China. They're transitioning from an export investment-driven economy to one that's consumption-oriented. Their working age is changing drastically. But currently, the people that live 60 and over account for 16% of the population, and the change to the 2 children policy has come too little, too late. By 2050, some estimates that 1 in 3 people will be aged over 65. That is going to have major implications on their buying habits and what kind of consumer economy we're looking at. And their labor costs, unfortunately, are going to increase as you have to sustain the different workforce that goes into retirement much sooner, or that the retirement sector grows much larger. So it's going to affect their competitiveness, the vitality of the market, and this can be offset by changes in technology. But that depends on that investment from them. The rising bad debt levels are a concern too. They're 280% of GDP at the moment and could become much worse in the coming decade to 2 decades, especially if it doesn't have an increased return on investment for the economy. Remember, I told you they're desperate to grow this economy and bring rags to riches to hundreds of millions of their citizens. They'll do everything and anything they can to do so. So what are the fastest countries outside China? You'll see Colombia in Latin America is a big player, Turkey and Poland in the European continent, Nigeria, Vietnam, India, and Bangladesh will be the biggest growing economies over the coming decades. But there are pitfalls to greater prosperity. Unfortunately, any excessive reliance on high population growth without delivering job increases will create civil unrest and high unemployment rates. Population growth creates demographic dividend, meaning money, an outcome for our younger people. And young people have always faced the bigger brunt of unemployment. Imagine that on a massive scale in some of these economies. The potential curse of natural resources. I've mentioned before, resource-rich countries have some risks. In some cases, wealth distribution is to the top 1% or less. So it is imperative that these economies reduce their dependency on the resources, or they're going to become more vulnerable to fluctuations in commodity prices. Also, it will crowd out manufacturing exports if currencies fluctuate too closely in line with resources and not GDP economic terms outside resources. Ideologies will hamper trade. Unfortunately, we've seen this for hundreds of years. Trade wars equal isolation equals less growth. Trumpism and his trade wars are dangerous. Japan's isolation in the 16th century, all the way up to China in the 50s, causing massive famine, and to North Korea today. You'll see a variance of these policies, but none of them have really brought prosperity to their citizens. How important are jobs to a younger working population? You'll see on the far right, average working age of the population and the average total population growth. If you look at the one part, China, right there, they're not growing their population. They have a net negative already. And we've seen in that one graph I showed you how their income, GDP per capita, is already still too low. This is going to be very challenging for them to provide new jobs to an aging population. Do they work longer? Many questions are to remain how China's going to adapt to this. Japan and Poland having some of the worst cases, though. If you go to the far left, Nigeria and Pakistan have major growth in population, and the average working age is far higher than that growth. Great news. Much more younger population ready to work and eager to be a part of the growing opportunities, hopefully, that their governments will bring. So definitely keep an eye out. That has its own risks too. So this end, you've got to bring jobs, plenty of jobs. And on this side, you got to manage a working age and the higher cost of your working population. So what are the opportunities for us? This is interesting. So there's going to be variable economic growth, which is normal as emerging markets mature. But be careful, the consumer markets there will be volatile comparative to ours because they're less developed. And so you need to be flexible with your business strategy. It will be ready to change on a dime, so to speak. Emerging markets are also becoming quite business friendly, so that's good news. So you'll have a dynamic work environment, much more knowledgeable working population, especially the younger ones that go to college abroad and come back home. So get involved with local partners and understand the nuances of these markets. But also be patient and be ready to ride out economic and political storms. Emerging markets will have plenty of ups and downs for the next decades. Especially countries like China that will feel the squeeze of an aging population and a growing demanding wealth for their consumers and citizens. But what does it mean to have ease of or a business-friendly economy? What does ease of doing business actually mean? In a normal class setting, I would break this down and have fun, but we'll do it here, and I'll just give you the data. Ease of business, people always talk about, California's a terrible state to do business. But what does that mean, right? It's about how do you start a business, how you manage working employees, the costs that you throw onto their businesses, dealing with construction, electricity, credit, for sure, paying taxes, trade, contract protections, as well as being able to close your business. In Austria, for example, the burden of a bankruptcy could last for decades on individual business owners. Unlike here in the United States, you could start and close a business within days and weeks with pretty much no problems. But the question is, are we the best place to do business? According to the data from the OEC that ranks ease of doing business, New Zealand is one of the best. Singapore is one of the best. The United States ranks at 6. It could get worse over time, but other nations are catching up. So we need as a nation to be competitive and be helpful for our businesses to not only survive, but thrive. Which economies, for example, let me pull that down, are really improving the fastest? You'll see that it's, let me pull that back up. It's a little harder with the slides. Nigeria is at the bottom, by the way. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Togo, Bahrain, Tajikistan, Pakistan, countries you would never imagine, including China, are getting on board to make it much easier to do business. And so you can see that list. I'll give you the link as well as in the previous slide, and you could play with the numbers on your own and see really who is who in doing business. And if you're in a construction company, you might not want to be in certain countries. If you're in trying to do legal services or other financial services, contracts will play a big role. How is it looking? The cost of starting up a business is falling quickly. Look at these drastic changes in countries like Nigeria, where starting a business, you wouldn't know what would happen in the 90s to your business or your subsidiary in Nigeria, let alone if you made $1 or money off of it. Today, very competitive, and imagine the next 10 years when their country becomes more apt at business-friendly policies. This could all, of course, change. Anything can change this. But it's very exciting to see a lot of countries get on board and get excited about being competitive in a globalizing world. And that means the United States has to keep going, keep competing. So how do you utilize this potential as a marketer? I think this is the final question that we are all yearning for. You got to have an in-depth understanding of the economic and social differences in these markets. Really do your homework on them. Tailor to their operating models. You don't want to just take what you're doing here and think it's going to work there. It's ethnocentric and borderline offensive. Businesses need to adapt to different climates on the whim, as I mentioned. So be patient. Navigate the differences that are going to change, the little bubbles that will happen, the little bursts that will occur. It's never easy, but think long term if you're going to enter these markets. So, in terms of the balance, you want to be operationally efficient. You want to have an innovative local market. So you want to be there and adapt to their different needs, technologically speaking. And also you want to have an excellent go-to-market strategy, embedding sales organizations with the local market and with appropriate language. You don't want to be there and offending people because you're thinking you're making a joke. And reality, you weren't. You're the outsider. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope you see that there's a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity. These aren't set in stone trends. Things will change, but be optimistic that even though there's going to be great challenges, great opportunities also exist. And I hope you take the time to look at the stats from PricewaterhouseCoopers. Thank you.